Okay, I'm gonna guess it works now. Sorry for the mess I made. But for now I'm just gonna go forward like this. We got here the PolitiScales political test. Don't ask me how I got recommended this. It just happened. The instructions are as follows. Welcome to the PolitiScale, the online political test. You will be confronted by a series of affirmations, and for each of them you will have to click on a button which corresponds the most to your opinion. Whoever wrote this doesn't have, oh fuck, I can't talk anymore. The first language of whoever wrote this is not English, but that's fine. It's not mine either. The questions assume that you are a citizen of a multi-party political system and a market economy, or more precisely that you know what both of these things entail. You can always avoid answering a question, but if you do not understand the meaning of one of them, try to invert its meaning for a better understanding of what is implied. Yeah. Okay, thanks for the hint, and also a little content warning. This test tries to represent the wider set of ideas as possible, the widest set of ideas possible, or as wide a set of ideas as possible. Yeah, sorry about that. And contains some phrases that can be shocking, notably concerning racism and homosexuality. Okay, I'm assuming everyone has gotten that. I'm not sure if everyone can see this. Okay, you can. Good. This is something I wanted to make sure. Now let's. There's a little sentence here. This quiz is a slightly modified version of PolitiScales, which is based on 8 values. I think I did this PolitiScales one before. I still have my results, but I'm not going to show them to you. I might compare and contrast the results I get now with the results I got back then, which coincidentally back then was about 2 or 3 years ago, I think. More like 3. Anyway, I'm starting the test now. 116 questions, so I'm not going to go into much detail on all of them, I'll just answer them. Wage labor is a form of theft from the worker by companies. Well, okay, to some extent I agree with that. The problem is, how do you decide how much of a wage the worker should have? If you can answer that in an effective way, then I might be fine with it. But if your answer is just how much the boss agrees, or how much the worker says he wants, well, that's a non-answer, because the worker can still even with their own agreement, workers can still get even if they agreed to it, workers can still receive less than their work is actually worth. And why would they receive less than their work is actually worth? Well, because they don't exactly know how much their work is worth, or because everyone around them pays them less than they are actually worth. They might try to start their own company, but they might not have the funds to actually do so, and they might find that their potential competitors, are more well entrenched, and therefore the risk they would get into would not justify all their effort. So even if they would accept to be paid less than they would actually deserve, even if counterintuitive as that may seem, because survival requires it. So regardless of my little tirade, which I promise I will not repeat with every question, I'm just going to say somewhat agree. Energy and transport structures should be a public matter. Absolutely agree. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. I would say, well, there are certain being a woman is not something that is just biology. I'll say that there is a certain should I say moral or psychological aspect that comes from general maturity, and might be differentiated for men and women. But overall, I'm gonna have to say I'm going to have to say, if we're talking like trans issues and such, this is really tricky. Rather disagree. The age of retirement should be lowered. Lowered from what standpoint? Let's say I somewhat agree. Order of authority should be respected in all circumstances. Bullshit. Mass strike is a good way to acquire new rights. I actually agree with that. If there is no other way, of course. It is important that health should stay a public matter. Absolutely agree. Space colonization is a good solution for supplying the lack of raw material on Earth. Iron, rare metals, fuel. To some extent, I might agree. However, it is to a much larger extent effective to just recycle everything that we already have. You can very easily do that, and it will be less expensive. So I have to say, rather disagree. The labor market enslaves workers. Well, it's not enslavement, but it's still coercion, so I'll have to say somewhat agree. Dismissals of employees should be forbidden except if it is justified. Well, again, what does justified mean? Because someone can be dismissed simply for sneezing. It's not a good justification, but it is a justification. So also, it doesn't matter if it doesn't matter from what I can tell from this sentence. It doesn't really matter if the justification comes at the point of dismissal or after the point of dismissal. So yeah, this is kind of a weird one. I'm just gonna say somewhat agree. I am equally concerned by the inhabitants of my country and those of other countries. Well, okay. What does my country mean for someone like me who is striving for dual citizenship but currently does not live in their country of origins? Does it mean I'm more concerned about the country I emigrated towards or about the country I'm from? Also, I can't really say I'm concerned with people from, say, another continent, because even if the actions that take place there, that, for example, impact climate change, will also impact me, there is the human mind has a limited capacity for attention and interest. So, to that extent, I have to say, or disagree. Sexual orientation is a social construct. Yeah, kind of agree with that. If two countries have similar economies, social systems, and environmental norms, then the free market between them has no negative impact. No negative impact for them. But I can guarantee you that two slave countries two countries that practice slavery have a negative impact within their economy on the population of the slaves. So for that reason, I absolutely disagree. Looking for one's own profit is healthy for the economy. What's healthy for the economy is for people having their needs met. That is what the economy is built upon. And if you can assure that with your economy, that is what you need to do. And looking out for one's own profit can actively harm that. That being said, is it worth having broke businesses if everyone is happy? Well, if everyone is happy, then businesses aren't broke because they're doing what they're supposed to do. But regardless, what they're supposed to do is not look out for their profit, it's make sure their clients are happy. So for that reason, I'm not going to say absolutely disagree, I'll say rather disagree. As long as they figure out where to manipulate their profit, they ought to be fine. Activism in existing political organizations is not relevant to change society. Absolutely disagree with that. The influence of religion should decrease. Absolutely agree. I want secular states as far as possible. And honestly, I see theocracies as failed states by default. Because keep in mind, I know we went to a different question. I still want to talk about that. Any question that has to rely on religious text, which can be interpreted in a whole slew of ways, is very prone to everything that makes a state go haywire. It is prone to corruption. It is prone to to misuses of power. It is prone to literally everything you can think of in that sense. You could argue that that is a risk for countries that are ruled based on a secular constitution, but really the risks with secular constitutions are much lower. So yeah. Moving on. Changing the system radically is counterproductive. We should rather transform it progressively. Yeah. That depends on where the system starts. However, as an absolute rule, I rather disagree. Market economy is optimal when it is not regulated. Absolutely disagree. Abortion should be limited to specific cases. Absolutely disagree. The filing and storage of personal records should be delimited strictly to database cross-checking. Okay, once again, the filing and storage of personal records should be delimited strictly, and database cross-checking should be forbidden. This is an interesting one. I'll agree with that. There are cases where it's helpful if cross-checking exists. However, allowing cross-checking means allowing for hacking backdoors. So, for this reason, I'm going to say rather disagree. The purpose of the judiciary system should be to punish those who went against the law. I want to say absolutely disagree. For one, if you look at the countries that have the lowest recidivism rates, i.e. the people who go to jail then stay out of jail after their stint, you'll notice that most of them are centered around rehabilitation rather than punitive measures. And in fact, the countries that are most strictly about punitive measures see the highest recidivism rates, i.e. doing petty crime once pretty much condemns you to become more criminally active in the future. So you should seek to redeem yourself, and any judiciary system should allow you to do that. If it doesn't, well then I disagree with it. My country must pay for the damages caused by the crimes it committed in other countries, or maybe even to other countries. I have to say, I agree with that. The right to be anonymous on the internet should be guaranteed. This is a tricky one. The internet and its anonymity does allow for some protection, and does allow for some inherent movement. However, there are cases where this anonymity can be manipulated in unsavory ways. So for that, I have to say, I can only say somewhat agree. Transgender individuals will never really be the gender they would like to be. Do you even know what gender is? Gender is whatever people say it is. And for the record, I'm a gender abolitionist. Like, I'll still use he/him pronouns, but otherwise don't really care much about gender presentation. For instance, I'm a guy and I like keeping my hair and nails long, which does get me in a bit of hot water with my parents. So for the record, I'm going to say absolutely disagree. We need to establish a monarchy to federate the people and preserve our sovereignty. Well, here's the problem. Federation can contradict sovereignty, because you're telling people that they can only control this part of the country they were born in. You limit sovereignty that way. And if you want the monarch to be the means by which sovereignty is maintained, well then, how do you appoint a monarch? Do you even appoint a monarch? Are you going hereditary? Are you going elective? And if you're going elective, how do you elect? This is a more complex question than really meets the eye. So, and because of that, it is not necessarily true. So I'll just say rather absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Prisons should no longer exist. No, I would say you still need detention, correction facility centers, even if you focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment of criminals. you could still call those prisons. But then again, there are people who are evil for the sake of being evil. There are psychopaths who didn't receive the attention they needed when they were young, or when they could still be healed, when they could still become highly functioning. Also, criminal insanity is a thing that exists. It solely for legal definition, but to some extent that legal definition exists for a reason. That it can be misconstrued does not mean it is invalid. So, to that point, I'll say somewhat agree. Members of a nation or culture have some unchangeable characteristics that define them. That depends on the characteristics you're talking about. But as a whole, I can't really say there is... and as a whole, I can't really say that the people that I share something with the people from my country that I don't share with people from other countries. Like what? Mother tongue? If your first language is English, you share that with a whole bunch of people who aren't from your from your countrymen. You could argue that it's still the same culture, but then again, I really wouldn't, because culture is way too easy to define as loose or as specific as you want. So for that reason, I'm going to have to say absolutely disagree. It is unfair to set a minimum penalty for an offense or a crime. Okay. Again, we're going back to the justice problem. It depends very much on what that penalty is. And in fact, there are a lot of cases of mistrials where sentences that are too lenient are given, or at least that's the case in certain areas of the world. Eastern Europe comes to mind for various reasons. So I'm going to have to say, for the most part, I want to stay as far away from the neutral as possible. So I'll just say rather disagree. A good policy is a pragmatic policy without ideology. This is okay. Well, let me tell you a little joke now. Broke. A good policy is a pragmatic policy without ideology. Woke. Realizing that what you think is a pragmatic policy is influenced by your ideology. Bespoke. Realizing that pragmatic policy is an ideology. In other words, I absolutely disagree with this. We should accept changes in our way of consuming food to limit the exploitation of nature. To some extent, I will say somewhat agree. Like you can't enforce these changes to some ridiculous extent, i.e., everyone should only eat salad on weekends or something like that. But if we're talking about limiting the access or availability or cultivation, so use, farming of specific food items, then I would say then I'd arguably be more okay with that, because people still have broad food options available, even if not as broad. So for that reason, I'm going to say somewhat agree. A language is defined by its users, not by scholars. Absolutely agree. Hormonal differences can explain some differences in individual characteristics between women and men. Yeah, absolutely agree. If depending on what you mean by some differences, do you mean the physical characteristics? And also, do you mean that all men are this way and all women are that way? Because that's not the case. It's pretty ambiguous. So for that reason, I'm just going to say somewhat. Social differences between ethnic groups cannot be explained by biology. I absolutely agree with that. The social roles of women and men can partly be explained by biological differences. Partly, yes. The other part is kind of complicated, and it's due to the fact that women, get babies and require to be and require protection during that during pregnancy and the early life of the child. That means that for the sake of the future, men need to step up, and that explains a whole bunch of things about the differences in the societal roles between women and men. But that's enough on that for now. I might get into it somewhat later. For now, I'm just going to say this. Abstinence should be preferred to contraception to preserve the true nature of the sexual act. The true nature of the sexual act doesn't matter. Like, there are so many other facets of our day-to-day life that we as humans have improved from the time that we were, hunter-gatherers and such, that really sticking to this as being the one thing that should remain natural is completely absurd. So, absolutely disagree. The police should be armed. What do you mean by armed? Should they get military-grade gear? I think not. Should they be able to restrain people who turn violent? Yes. Should they restrain all people because all people might become violent? No. You need more social work than police in general. I would say. At least in all the cases. At least in all the most media-sized cases. So for that reason, I will say rather disagree. The categories women and men are social constructs that should be given up. This one is interesting. Because you know the obvious question that that comes up here. Women and men are not just sociological differences, are not just sociological categorizations. They are also biological ones. And do we replace women and men in biology? And what do we say then? Male, female? So it's the same number of same number of syllables, but I don't know. I don't know what to say to that. Yeah, let's do it. We must fight against global warming. Yes, it is better to arrest someone potentially dangerous preemptively rather than taking the risk of having them committing a crime. Well, prevention rather than yeah, okay, this is actually a good one. I'm gonna have to say somewhat agree. Euthanasia should be authorized. Yeah, I agree. It's your right to kill yourself if you want to. It is acceptable that some industry sectors are private. Yeah, I agree with that. It is necessary to massively invest in research to improve productivity. To some extent, I would agree to that. To another extent, there is such a thing as toxic productivity, where you make too much that literally nobody else needs, for one. And for another thing, how about what happens with the actual research? How do you implement it in such a way that it improves productivity? That is a question you're not. That is another question that this little sentence doesn't go into. For that reason, I'm only going to say somewhat agree. Sabotage is legitimate under certain conditions. Yes, I agree. Homosexuals should not be treated equally with heterosexuals with regards to marriage, parentage, adoption, or procreation. Fuck you. Minimum levels of salary should be ensured to make sure that a worker can live off their work. I would say it should be tied to inflation. So just, give people money. Because if you give people money, you also give them the means by which they can ensure their survival. And if they have the means to ensure their survival, they'll generally survive. And if you can do that with minimal salary, then then that's good. Other countries don't have that, but other countries might also have other means by which even though you don't de jure have that, you de facto have that. So for that reason, I absolutely agree. Everyone should receive should receive enough to live off, because everyone deserves the right to the right to live, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and all that shit. Sexual assaults are partly caused by men's natural impulse. Bullshit. It is necessary to implement assemblies to ration our production to the consumers according to their needs. Oh, so remember that thing I said about production? Yeah. I think this very much ties into that, but I'm not necessarily sure that these assemblies really are what what you think they actually are. So I really don't know what to say here. I'm just gonna say absolutely agree. We can look at what they look like and how much they ration somewhat later. Hacking has a legitimate place in political struggle. This goes into a discussion about violence as a tool for political action. There are places where it is justified, for example in defending others. Does hacking count as that? I'll say yes. So absolutely agree. Violence against individuals is never productive. Well, let's see. Is restraining an assailant not productive? Is restraining someone who won't cooperate with with authorities not productive? I would say that's not the case. But if we're talking about stuff like assassinations, yeah, this is actually kind of a tricky question. But for the most part, I'm more inclined to disagree. Humans should neither eat nor exploit animals. This one, I don't agree with this, because to some extent we need protein, and I'm not sure there is enough of a plant base to where we can really have where I'm not sure that our current agriculture techniques will really allow us to have all the proteins we need solely from plant sources. So some level of meat eating might be required. That doesn't necessarily mean I support factory farming, but it does mean that I disagree with this question. I'll say rather. The values of my country are superior to those of other countries. Well, okay, we're talking about differences in terms of the values of which country. But if we're talking about my country, again, I emigrated somewhere else, and I'm trying to get dual citizenship. So which of my countries is superior? So which of my citizenship countries would be superior in that case? For the most part, if we're talking in absolute terms, no, absolutely disagree. The maximum allowed hours in the legal work week should be increased. Absolutely disagree. The fact that some schools and universities are private is not a problem. The fact that some let's rephrase this somewhat. The fact that some kids with rich parents can get better education even though they're complete idiots is not a problem. See the problem there? Absolutely disagree. Offshoring and outsourcing are necessary evils to improve production. Absolutely disagree. All sciences, even chemistry and biology, are not uncompromising and are conditioned by our society. Remember what I said earlier about women and men also being biological indicators? Yeah, this is the stuff I mean. And to some extent, knowledge is conditioned by our society. Or more precisely, what knowledge we do in fact discover to some extent it relies on itself, but we as people who view it and interpret it not through a strictly objective lens. We are interpreting it through the lens that our education gives us. Think about racist pseudoscience. It doesn't exist because there is some inherent difference that makes said piece of pseudoscience justified. It exists because it was supposed to justify something that already existed within the given society, because it was supposed to mirror attitudes that could already be found in general society. So for that reason, I'm going to have to say I don't absolutely agree to this, as in they are not entirely conditioned by our society, and they do in fact have the potential to change their society, but they are influenced by it. So somewhat agree. Borders should eventually be abolished. This is a tricky one. This is a tricky question that also has some ties towards nationalism, because I think nationalism is not necessarily a bad thing. I think people have the right to define themselves as they wish and find other people with whom they share whatever characteristic they want to define themselves by, and ally themselves. If that includes a specific nationhood, then that's fine. Regrettably, that will also mean that borders are required to exist. Even if we're not talking about fences, we're still talking about lines on maps. And abolishing those creates questions regarding who manages what, who administers what. And I don't exactly know how this question is supposed to address those problems. For that reason, I'm going to have to say, okay, I really don't know. I hesitate between this, and this. I want to stay as far away from neutral as possible for the most part, because, well, it's kind of a nothing answer. But I'm going to say, rather disagree. No one should get rich from owning a business, housing, or land. I absolutely agree with that. You should get rich off of your own merit. And owning a business is not a merit, it's a property deed. Starting a business, well, that is a merit, but it's not a merit that gets you, but it's not really a merit that can get you rich. Does your business fulfill a need? Good, that should get you rich. Good, that should get you rich. But you should not become rich just because you own a business that satisfies a need. You should own a business because you contribute. You should get rich because you own a business that contributes to a need. A business that contributes to a need, not just the business in and of itself, For that reason, I'm going to have to say, I'm not going to just somewhat agree, I'm going to say absolutely agree, because I place one more condition based on from that. Selfishness is the overriding drive in the human species, no matter the context. Not actually true. For a variety of reasons. There are plenty of animals that will actively eat their offspring, for example, if they encounter them, regardless of whether or not they are their own. So therefore, humans don't do that, even if they are starving. And in fact, the idea of that absolutely disgusts them. So this is very much not the case. Do I say or disagree? People still are to some extent selfish. I'll say that. People still want something they can have control over, something they can. Something they have responsibility, and something they can draw a direct benefit from. So to that extent, to the extent to which it is necessary for their survival, they are selfish. But otherwise, I would say rather disagree. It is necessary to teach history in order to create a sense of belonging to the nation. There are many other reasons to teach history aside from nation building. I'll say this. But if this is your only reason why you should, why you should teach why you should teach history, well, there are many other ways of establishing a connection to your nation, to your birth state. That is through learning tradition, learning culture, learning law. That does to some extent require history, but it is not the focus of it. It is not the focus of various specific events. For that reason, I'm going to say rather disagree. Nowadays, employees are free to choose when signing a contract with their future employer. Not quite. You can choose, not quite, unless you mean you're free to choose to starve, or you're free to choose to stay on unemployment benefits. For that reason, I'm going to have to say, okay, I can't talk anymore. Okay, let's rewind a bit. Nowadays, employees are free to choose when signing a contract with their future employer. They're free to choose between employers, yes. But that does not mean that the choice they would make is the one that would absolutely fit them best in all circumstances. It is the choice they are making because other factors are preventing them from are pretty much forcing their hands into taking. For example, your unemployment benefits run out, and you can't renew your application. So you have to find something within the next few weeks. You're gonna find the first thing that is really offered to you in that case, because keep in mind the alternative could be homelessness or something worse. So for that reason, I'm gonna say rather, not absolutely, just rather. Marriage should be abolished. Marriage should be liberalized, but not necessarily abolished. So I'm gonna have to say, what do I mean by marriage should be liberalized? I mean you shouldn't place certain conditions on whether or not you can in fact get married. Also, the limits by which you draw marriage should be are to a certain extent a bit too rigid. Also, the things you lose are a bit too serious when it comes to that. And I have to ask, what are you going to replace marriage with as a means of mapping out population dynamics and such? Like, I understand where this idea is coming from, but I can't say I agree with, or at least I can't say I agree to it yet. So for that reason, I'm going to have to say rather disagree. Armed struggle in a country is sometimes necessary. Are we talking? What are we talking about? Are we talking about civil war? Are we talking about fighting off an invasion? Are we talking about quelling protests? Are we talking about stopping terrorist attacks? This is a very open-ended question. And while I can come up with a lot of examples that are overall positive when it comes to the context in which armed struggle is used, that doesn't mean there aren't many others that aren't. For that reason, I'm going to have to say I somewhat agree. Heavy penalties are efficient because they are dissuasive. No. Providing more effective alternatives to actually carrying out the deed are much more dissuasive. Eliminating poverty or implementing programs aimed at reducing poverty will do much more or will be much more effective at combating theft than heavy prison sentences for theft will do. For that reason, absolutely disagree. My religion must be spread as widely as possible. My religion is atheism, so I would want as many people as possible to be atheists, but really I don't think that is I don't really think that is something that should be imposed by a specific government. I'll just say I'll say absolutely disagree here. Nobody is by nature predisposed to criminality. Absolutely agree. Environmental norms should be influenced by mass consumption and not from an authority. Yeah, you're talking out of your ass. Sorry. The sacrifice of some civil liberties is a necessity in order to be protected from terrorist acts. Okay, now this one delves right into the topic. Sacrifice of some civil liberties. I will say, are you familiar with the concept of the dictator as per ancient Rome? Like during the days of the Roman Republic, in times of an absolute crisis, the Romans would generally choose one guy who would be the dictator, and until that crisis is solved, that guy will have the absolute power. And then after the crisis is solved, that guy is stripped from his powers, and everything returns to normal. Truth be told, a lot of those guys could then just misuse their power and use it to make their position a little bit more permanent. And in fact, that's what happened to Caesar, and it let the genie out of the bottle and led to the formation of the Roman Empire. But so yeah, that didn't necessarily work out for them. In more modern context, however, to some extent I agree to that. To another extent, however, I really can't. You really need to look into more. You can't just say, okay, because one guy blew up a school once, everyone needs to, I don't know, sign a specific form 3 times a day. That's absolute bullshit. You really need to look more specifically into the guilty parties and take more targeted actions. You can't just blanketly you can't just lay a blanket condemnation upon the entire populace. If we're talking stuff like the the pandemic we're currently experiencing, then I might agree with certain limits being placed on certain civil liberties. However, when it comes to terrorist attacks, when it comes to small specific actions, then you need to take small specific steps. For that reason, I absolutely disagree. Preserving non-urban ecosystems is more important than creating jobs. I absolutely agree. It is necessary to avoid a private monopoly. I'm actually kind of mixed on that, because Japan Railways is the best railway system on the planet, and it is entirely private. So, okay, there is one example that works, but there are plenty of examples that are outright hostile and inhospitable. So to that extent, I'm gonna say rather disagree. Even though economies of scale can lead to natural monopolies, but the problem with those is a little more complicated. Still, they should not be private, and they still should be. There should be legal steps that are taking place when that are put in place when it comes to dealing with those. Anyway, it is important to encourage an agriculture that maintains a food biodiversity, even if the output is inferior. I think you mean a specific level of food biodiversity. So at least, a yield that should have at least X many crops, regardless of regardless of how substantial the that output or that food yield actually ends up being. To some extent, I'll say output inferiority is really just a is really just a meaningless label. Like there's lots of food that gets thrown away because it is deemed not good enough, even though it's still perfectly edible or still perfectly usable. And in fact, food waste is very much the main problem. In all of in every modern country on the planet. So I'm going to have to say that the output being inferior would actually be a good thing. So, absolutely agree. Transforming ecosystems durably to increase the quality of life of human beings is legitimate. What do you mean by transforming ecosystems? Do you mean making jungles more habitable for human life? I'll say no. Because human life requires those jungles even if it doesn't live within them. And it doesn't live within them. If we're talking about transforming stuff like urban, suburban, or rural ecosystems in such a way that they are they increase the quality of life, so that you have, for example, better transport connections or more access to or make cities more walkable, well then that I would agree to. For now, but if we're talking about making biomes not meant for humans into biomes that are meant for humans, I disagree with that. But for now, I'm going to have to say somewhat agree. Citizens should take priority over foreigners. There are certain cases where you could argue you have no choice, but those choices really aren't enough to make me go rather disagree, so absolutely disagree. Reduction of waste should be done by reducing production. Absolutely agree. That is the main method by which waste is actually generated. So let's deal with that. Conditions of life in jail should be greatly improved. Yes, I agree. Having your freedom taken away is bad enough. People need to stand up for their ideals, even if it leads them to betray their country. I would argue especially if it leads. I'm not going to argue especially if it leads them to betray their country, because, I don't want to encourage fascists, but at the same time, if someone wants to secularize a theocracy, they absolutely should do that. So, somewhat agree. National chauvinism during sports competitions is not acceptable. No, but some degree of ribbing is kind of fun. So, yeah. I really don't know what to say about this. If we're talking about cussing foreign athletes, yeah, that's bullshit. Using slurs on them, yeah, that is very much not something that not something that should happen. Whether or not there are lighter forms of what one could call national chauvinism that could be acceptable, yeah, that's a tricky question. Is it just saying our guys are gonna win national chauvinism? Is it saying our guys are better than yours, national chauvinism? Kind of a tricky question, so for that I'm just gonna say somewhat agree. Differences in treatment and quality of life in our society show that racism is still omnipresent. Maybe not omnipresent, but still around. So I'm gonna have to say yes. Technological progress must not change society too quickly. Well, I don't know. Any kind of technological progress that makes people not be poor is something that should very much be implemented. So yeah, I can't agree with that. I can't. I guess I wasn't explicit enough. We should always distance ourselves from protesters who use violence. I think gonna say I've been around protests enough to hear a whole bunch of variants on this, because people will use lone protesters acting violently to denounce everything about everything about that specific protest, as last year, as 2020 has shown. However, if certain civil authorities use violence on protesters, I think retaliating in self-defense is legitimate. So to that extent, oh wait a second, from protesters who use violence, but do they use it initiatively or as a reaction? That is something that this quiz doesn't specify. For that reason, I'm going to say somewhat agree. Activists must always act in strict accordance with the law. Again, if they are attacked by law enforcement, should they still should they be able to fight back? That's the question. Is law enforcement acting legally? Also, what is legally? If legally means in accordance to the orders of their superiors, well then, should the activists just withdraw, even though their superiors are acting against procedure or acting against established law? This is a very difficult question, one that I am more inclined to disagree than agree with, if I am to be honest. But then again, only going directly forward to the legal means does take away some imagination when it comes to protests. So I guess I'm gonna say imagination doesn't particularly matter, except if we're talking about diversifying your message. But if we're talking about spreading it as widely as possible, I think acting illegally is sometimes justified. But if the law you're protesting, but if the law that keeps you from performing activism is unjust, I still think I still think it is within your right to act against it. For that reason, I'm gonna say I rather disagree. Nuclear fission, when well maintained, is a good source of energy. Well, I've heard enough from various people who say that nuclear has more energy density than any other renewables. Whether or not you wish to consider nuclear energy renewable. So it is in that sense good, but the problem with nuclear energy is waste. What do you do with it? Where do you store it? Where do you store it? Or where do you, pack it up? You could shoot it into space, but really I don't think that's. But really, should we do that? Also, I'm pretty sure someone suggested it at least once, and there might be some more pragmatic reasons why that doesn't work. Yeah. I'm going to say somewhat agree. Maintaining strong economic growth should be an objective for the government. If your population shrinks, then it is perfectly natural for your economy to also shrink, because you have to fulfill the same needs but for a smaller population. So no. Strong economic growth should not be an objective of government. If the needs of your population require it, then do it. But otherwise, absolutely disagree. Insurrection is necessary to deeply change society. I can't think right now of an example of a society that has been changed deeply without insurrection, but my first instinct is to go, no. You can change society deeply though maybe not immediately, even with other means. Transhumanism will be beneficial because it will allow us to improve our capacity. Again, which us are you talking about? If you make them super rich, then all you do is create rich superhumans lording over poor, poor slaves. You're essentially creating an oligarchic technocracy. Not something that should be not something that I think is desirable. If you can ensure that the benefits really will go precisely where they are needed, then I might agree with this. Then I might agree with this statement. But for now, it is too ambiguous. So I'm going to have to say that I disagree. State-run companies should be managed like private ones and follow the logic of the market: competition, profitability, etc. Okay, this is one part where I disagree. This is a statement I disagree with, but that's more due to the way I approach state-run companies, because I think state-run companies should be active in places where a typical market cannot, for various reasons, effectively provide a necessary product or a necessary service. It's called market failure. Because a state-run company wouldn't have the same limitations that at least an incipient private one would. So therefore, under that idea, a state-run company doesn't really need to follow the logic of the market because it is operating outside of any market. If we're talking about state-run companies that operate within a market, well, I want to say I still kind of want to say no, because state-run companies aren't just accountable to their leadership. They are also accountable to the various committees that allocate their funds, and also ultimately to the population as a whole. And they have to provide. They are not just provide them with certain products or services. They also have to do so in a responsible way, and that is an option for private companies if they want to persist, but it is an absolute necessity for state-run companies because otherwise they are a waste and a dysfunctionality within the political system. So going by competition and profitability doesn't also. So yeah, I completely lost track of what I wanted to say. Sorry about that. The point is I'll have to wait for my point. It's actually really hard to talk and think at the same time. A state-run company following the logic of the market, operating within a market, would have competitors, and therefore it has to counteract the actions of those competitors for reasons that should perhaps become obvious by now. That is not an option. That is not something that the competitors should desire, because state-run companies have the backing of the state. They can literally just call up almost anyone and have them fill in a gap. That gives them an insane advantage and leads directly to a monopoly. True, there is somewhat more oversight, at least in principle, when it comes to the operations of state-run companies, but it is overall I have to say it's it can still lead to a damaging result far too precipitously. For that reason, I'm going to have to say, I'm torn between absolutely and matter. I'm going to say absolutely. Revolutions will always end up in a bad way. 1776, 1789 kind of disprove you. As for other revolutions, plenty of them ended up fairly well. The fact that they were later usurped does not change that. So I'm going to have to say absolutely disagree. It's not always, and most of the times when it does, there are outside reasons, not directed to the not necessarily from the revolution itself. Research produced by my country should not be available to other countries. Absolutely disagree. That is the main benefit of globalization. The free travel of people and information. So us being able to solve our problems much faster than we would have otherwise. Patents should not exist. This is a tricky one. Like, on one hand, I understand. On one hand, I understand wanting to keep your profitability, but if whatever you're inventing will have a higher benefit if it is if whatever you're inventing has a higher benefit if it exists within general society, then not keeping it under a patent would allow it to disperse much more. So for that reason, I could choose to I think abolishing patents might be a good thing. However, what other arguments? What other arguments are there? That patent is the result of your work, and you should be rewarded for it. Well, by that point, you could. You should. You could argue that pretty much any kind of intellectual effort should be. Should be gatekept, and I pretty much disagreed with that a question ago. So. Also, are patents really actually effective at protecting intellectual property? Because I don't think they are. I mean, let's be honest. Within the automotive industry, it doesn't take if a certain company invents a certain technology and patents it, should it decide to patent it, the existence of a patent won't stop other people from copying the thing and just by just calling it differently somehow. So yeah, patents to that extent seem kind of useless, and also they're weirdly written. So also a lot of times they're deliberately obscurely written, so they could really just be about anything and are just used to stifle innovation. For that reason, I'm going to have to say, yeah, absolutely agree. It is merit that explains differences of wealth between two individuals. I absolutely disagree. Because again, you can inherit wealth, and the only merit you get there is a rich parent. Some sectors or type of employment should be financially supported. Well, okay, what are we, when you say some sectors or type of employment, are we talking teachers, postal workers, and military men? Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Are we talking about other stuff? Also, and if we are talking about other stuff, what other stuff are we talking about? Are we talking about the automotive industry, the the armaments industry, or other such things? You're way too vague here. So I'm just gonna have to say somewhat. It is necessary to remove regulations in labor legislation to encourage firms to hire. Oh boy. If you remove regulations in labor legislation, the only thing, you're not encouraging firms to hire. You're encouraging firms to mishandle their talent. And they will do it. They will do it if they think they can make a buck. If they can make a buck out of them. Because keep in mind, their assessments are not entirely reliant on a person's actual potential, but what they think the potential of a person is. And their assessment of a person's potential might be wrong. For this reason, removing labor legislation to encourage firms to hire will only encourage them to be reckless with the talent pool they have available. For that reason, I'm going to have to say, absolutely disagree. Traditions should be questioned. Absolutely. A good citizen is a patriot. If by patriot you mean someone who is who follows the spirit of the law rather than the letter, I might agree. If we're talking someone who respects the letter of the law regardless of what the letter says, no. Justice should always take into consideration the context and the past of the condemned and adapt their penalty accordingly. Okay, remember what I said about certain punishments being about justice being retributive rather than punitive? This is where it comes into contact. And a lot of people will talk about how this means that black people or generally minorities should be given lighter sentences because they were generally more likely to okay. I'm gonna rewind a bit again. Justice should take into consideration the context and the past of the condemned and adapt their penalty accordingly. A lot of people will think that this means that minorities ought to receive lesser penalties because they went through more hardship in life, and absolutely disagree with that. But you can very easily flip it on its head and say that rich people should receive more decisive punishments or more severe punishments, because after all, they were rich. They could decide to do literally anything with their life, and they decided to do something this stupid or this heinous as a crime. Does that mean anything? I would agree to that somewhat, maybe. However, you could very easily see this the wrong way, as in give minorities harsher sentences and give rich people lighter sentences because of what you perceive as their merit to society might be. Do I agree with either of those? That, in general, I think the focus of the justice system should be, as I said, not punitive, but redemptive. And when it comes to redemption, you need to consider the context and the past of the person, and give them the means by which they are able to redeem themselves. So it's not just about So it's not just about punishment, it's also about treatment when it comes to punishment. So, or penalty. For that reason, I'm going to have to say, somewhat agree. It is acceptable that there are rich and poor people. It is acceptable that certain people make more money, yes, because remember, from each according to ability to each according to need, and yes, I am going that way. That doesn't mean everyone has the same need or the same ability. And in fact, the existence of differences within them is precluded in the in the definition. So there being people who have higher needs is perfectly acceptable, and there being people with higher means is also to some extent equally acceptable. The question only stems from how these means come to be. That being said, what does it mean to be poor? Like, can poor people still I don't know, go out every now and then? Can poor people still, enjoy some kind of hobby? Can poor people still to what extent does being poor affect your quality of life? Can you do can you still do almost whatever? Can you still do almost whatever, and then being rich allows you to do just a little more? Or does being poor mean you really just have to hustle 24/7? Like that is another question that this sentence raises but doesn't really address. For that reason, I'm going to have to say rather disagree. Foreigners enrich our culture. How do you define culture? I'll tell you how I define culture. Culture is the reflection of the lived experience of people within a given area. That area can be a city, a county, a nation, even a neighborhood or a continent. So, therefore, does having people from more varied backgrounds mean you have more varied life experiences? I'll say yes. So for that reason, I'm going to go with absolutely agree. In some specific conditions, the death penalty is justified. I've been talking again and again about how justice should be redemptive rather than punitive, but I actually think there are some specific conditions where the death penalty actually works. Namely, those where redemption is impossible, or where the person who is guilty of certain crimes chooses to run away from redemption, or chooses to conduct themselves in such a way that redemption is still impossible. It becomes impossible. Would exile be preferable? Perhaps, but then again, where would you exile that person to? You're not solving the problem that way. You're just pushing it somewhat further. So I have to say, contrary to what perhaps my answers so far have made you think, somewhat agree. Multiculturalism is a threat to our society. If your society is threatened by people from various areas being within it, then it is a fucking weak-ass society. Absolutely disagree. Individuals who get out of prison should be assisted in their reinsertion. The assistance to reinsertion should happen while in prison. That is why I keep saying retributive rather than not retributive. Redemptive rather than punitive. Redemptive rather than retributive. Yeah. I'm going with that. But if you're going to go punitive, you will need to assist them in in getting their bearings again. So, absolutely agree. Question 100: the state should be abolished. This one. You could very much do that. However, I have to ask, what is the purpose of the state in general affairs? What does the state do? How does the state benefit you? And can you obtain the same benefits of the state without having a state? That is something I don't know. I'm not sure whether or not that is the case. So for that reason, I can't really say. I can't really say I really agree with this statement. Overall, though, there are plenty of attributes of the state that could be redirected or that are already taken care of by other political / administrative tasks. So maybe somewhat agree. I do not have any problem if other official languages are added or replace the already existing official language in my country. Again, what country are we talking? Are we talking just generally? Well then, generally I'll say yes. I'll say I do not have any problem. Oh, if it benefits the people already in it, then it should happen. Biologically, human beings are designed for heterosexuality. They are designed for heterosexual reproduction. But that does not mean that does not necessarily mean heterosexuality. That does not necessarily mean that women should always wear dresses, or that men should always men are designed to be hunters and therefore should always be the hunters. This is in a best case scenario, this sentence is way too vague. Worst case scenario, it is wrong. Either way, absolutely disagree. Foreigners living in my country should be allowed to act politically equally to those who have the nationality. That depends on how long they've been there, or more precisely, how long they plan to stay within their new country. Because there are situations in which, when it comes to, there are situations in which their status as foreigners prevents them from really acting as effectively as citizens of a country, as people who are born and raised within that country can act. For example, when it comes to national elections, if you just got to a place and have no clue who the parties are, what they stand for, and the election is tomorrow, is the day after you arrive in the country, then I don't think you should be allowed to vote. If you've been around for somewhere between 5 and 8 years and have been able to act politically, or maybe not necessarily act politically, but observe what various parties stand for, and have had the ability to observe what the consequences of the actions of these parties are, then I think you should be allowed to that. I think you should be allowed to act in a manner that is closer to equal. That is closer to equal to when compared to those who already have the nationality. For that reason, I'm going to say Also, do you still count as foreigner if you already have the, maybe not the nationality, but the citizenship? That's something you're not addressing. Either way, I'll have to say somewhat agree. Also, also because I'm a European citizen, the Treaty of Lisbon is in effect, and according to the Treaty of Lisbon, if you're an EU citizen and live somewhere else in the EU, you can vote in that place for local elections in whatever place you've moved to. So yeah, that's a good thing overall. So somewhat agree. Social assistance deters people from working. Social assistance only deters people who otherwise have things to do, such as students and young mothers, from working. But otherwise, I don't think most people would. I don't think most people would mind getting both social assistance and a paycheck, and a more regular paycheck that they actually work for. So, absolutely disagree. It is legitimate for a country to intervene militarily to defend its economic interests. I will say no. Unless the alternative is that your entire population dies out, my answer is no. Because unless you're if your economic that's the line I draw. If the economic interest is I don't want my people to starve or otherwise die, then I agree. But if your economic interest is I want the rich of my country to become even richer, you're out of line, and I'm not gonna pay for that. And I think anyone who thinks they pay too many taxes should agree with that. We need to make compromises with the opposition to apply our ideas. To some extent, I might agree because there are certain policies that are more important than others, and that would require a more speedy implementation. But the fact that you implement compromises might lead to your overall effectiveness becoming reduced. What does that? And then again, it is your effectiveness. It is the effectiveness of your political movement. Your political movement does not necessarily have to be the only political movement of a given society. If you're, for example, elected president, you don't just become president for the people who voted for you. You also become the president for people who voted against you. And whatever action you take also has to be in their best interest. So what does it mean? What does it mean for you to act in their best interest? Does it mean making compromises? And if it does mean making compromises, what do you compromise on? How does the dialogue work? I'll have to say I'm gonna go with somewhat agree, because certain ideas do need to take priority in general when it comes to political action. So and pretty much most means that are available when it comes to prioritizing them are acceptable. GMOs should be forbidden outside of research and medical purposes. Absolutely disagree. It is not acceptable that human actions should lead to the extinction of species. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Banks should remain private. I really want to go the opposite way and just make just really nationalize all banks, because that way that it's true that they fuck off Book and Drive. I don't think banks should remain private. They already have way too much money they already have way too much money for their own good. Nationalizing them, or socializing them, means that means not necessarily they have more regulation that they should follow that would prevent them from stopping, but they'd have more oversight. They would the people who would try to implement something that is either stupid or illegal would have to cross more hurdles in order to do that which actually is stupid or illegal. So for that reason, I am very much opposed to banks being private, if given the chance. Schools should mostly teach our values, traditions, and fundamental knowledge. Way, way, way too fucking vague. Like, what are our values? Not complaining about the state a value? Is free speech a value? Also, is general well-being a value? And we're talking about traditions. Again, what traditions are we talking about? Also, what fundamental knowledge? This, once again, is way too vague. For that reason, I'm going to have to say rather disagree. 6 more questions. Revenues and capital should be taxed to redistribute wealth. Absolutely. The main goal of a couple is to make at least one child. Absolutely disagree. Exploitation of fossil fuels is necessary to some extent for now, but it is excessive and has been for a long while. Somewhat agree. Still, somewhat agree. Loans contracted by the public sector, contracted by the public sector, do not necessarily have to be repaid. Loans contracted by the public sector. Who do they loan to? And what do these loans, or more precisely, what does not respecting the repayment conditions entail? This is a question that this statement doesn't really address. For that reason, I'm leaning towards rather disagree. Elections organized by the state cannot question the powers in place. The whole point of elections is to question the powers in place. So, absolutely disagree. Changes in an individual's way of life can induce changes in society. That depends on individuals and how much influence they have over the ability of others. For the most part, though, that is a fact. Whether or not those changes are for ill or not, that's a different question. I'm going to say absolutely agree. And now let's look at the result. Okay, this is something. And these are my results. I also get this cool little flag: equality, humanity, socialism. Yeah. I scored huge on conservatism, rehabilitative justice. Well, I've mentioned it all throughout this video, so I'm much more progressive than I'm conservative. I like that this gray strip is relatively small. It's been under 20% all along. Internationalism over nationalism, 17%. Yeah. There's still a little bit of a survivalist in me, so, and that's probably why this is the case. Internationalism is 67%. Communism over capitalism, 83%. I did at one point take a test that strictly looked at how communist I was, and I only got a 40% on that one, so whatever. But apparently I prefer some tenets of what this test describes as communism over those of capitalism. Next up, regulation over laissez-faire. I like that laissez-faire is presented with this, this butterfly. Like, oh, people who advocate for laissez-faire capitalism are so fragile. Ecology is at 57%. And production is only 26%. Yeah, No surprises here. Revolution is at 48%, Reform is at 36%. Yeah. Not surprising. Do I have anything else? Okay. These things. Yeah. I'll link these in the I'll I don't know, copy these somewhere and post them through my social media, my Instagram, for example. I think you'll find a link to it in the in a master link, which I'll have to update after I finish this stream. Anyway, thank you for your attention. Sorry I bungled this thing up, but I hope you enjoy this process regardless, and I hope my words weren't too willy-nilly, and I hope my voice wasn't too scratchy. I'm actually kind of feeling a bit I'm kind of feeling it being strained right now. Anyway, this is my result. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like, maybe even share it wherever you think others will like it as well. If you want to see when my next one comes out, then please subscribe. Ideally, also ring the bell in order for YouTube to notify you. And if you have anything you'd like to add to anything that that I've mentioned or you've seen in this video, then what can I say? The comment section awaits your input. Until next time, I have been the One Take Man.